The sun was setting over New York City, painting the sky in orange hues that contrasted with the shadows of the skyscrapers. In Central Park, Richard Morgan walked alone, his steps echoing on the paved path as he tried to distance himself from the weight of responsibilities he carried as president of one of the country's largest construction companies. At 45, he had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of materially, but something was still missing in his life. The cold June wind rustled the tree leaves, creating a gentle melody that always calmed him. It was a ritual he had maintained since his teenage years, when he still lived at St. Mary's Orphanage. Solitary walks were his way of processing thoughts, of finding peace amid the chaos of corporate life. On that particular night, something was different. As he passed near one of the park's lakes, his eyes caught an unusual movement. Under the dim light of a lamppost, a small figure huddled against the trunk of a century-old tree. It was a boy, couldn't have been more than 10 years old, wearing only a thin, worn-out t-shirt, totally inadequate for the cold weather. Richard stopped, observing the scene carefully. The boy was visibly shaking, his thin arms hugging his knees against his chest. His dark, disheveled hair partially covered his face, but the paleness of his skin and the fear in his eyes were visible. "Hey, kid," called Richard, approaching slowly so as not to frighten him. "Are you okay?" The boy slowly raised his gaze, and Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Those eyes. There was something familiar about them, something that instantly transported him to his own past, to lonely nights when he wished he had someone to call him son. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice soft. "See, Charlie," the boy responded, his voice barely a whisper. Richard looked around, searching for an adult, someone responsible, but the park was practically deserted at that hour. "Where are your parents?" The D. Boy looked away, his fingers gripping his knees even tighter. I don't have them anymore." Those words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. It was then that he noticed something even more disturbing. The boy's legs were positioned strangely, and he seemed unable to move properly. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crouching down to be at eye level with the boy. Charlie hesitated before answering, as if fearing the consequences of his honesty. "My legs, they don't work right since I fell." The way he said it, the tremor in his voice, suggested there was much more to that story than a simple accident. Richard recognized the subtle signs of neglect, the invisible marks that only someone who had lived through something similar could identify. "Have you been here alone for a long time?" "A few days," Charlie murmured. "People pass by, but no one stops." Richard felt his throat tighten. In his mind, flashbacks of his own childhood in the orphanage mixed with the scene before him. How many times had he himself wished that someone would stop, that someone would notice him? "Do you want to come with me?" he offered, extending his hand. "I can take you to a safe place, get medical help for your legs." The boy looked at the outstretched hand with a mixture of hope and distrust. You won't abandon me later?" The question, so simple and yet so loaded with meaning, made Richard swallow hard. "No, Charlie, I promise I won't abandon you." For a long moment, the boy just looked at the outstretched hand, as if weighing all the broken promises he had already lived against this new offer of help. Then, slowly, his small trembling hand reached for Richard's. The touch triggered something deep in both of them, a connection that transcended words. Richard carefully helped the boy to his feet, noticing how he could barely support himself on his own legs. Without hesitation, he picked him up, feeling how frighteningly light he was. "Let's go home, Charlie," he said softly, beginning to walk towards the park's parking lot. "First, we'll take care of you. Then we'll sort out everything else." He walked with the boy in his arms. Richard couldn't imagine how that encounter would completely change his life. The gears of fate had begun to move, and nothing would be the same for either of them. Richard's mansion in the Upper East Side, with its imposing walls and huge windows, seemed even grander to Charlie's frightened eyes. The car passed through the automatic gates and parked near the main entrance, where Martha, the housekeeper who had been working for Richard for 15 years, was already waiting for them, alerted by a hurried phone call during the journey. "My God, Richard, what happened?" Martha asked, running to help him with the boy. Her always welcoming brown eyes widened at the sight of the child's condition. "I'll explain better later," Richard replied, carrying Charlie inside. "Now we need a doctor. I've already called Dr. Paul. He's on his way." The boy was taken to one of the guest rooms on the first floor, considering his difficulty in moving. The room, larger than any place Charlie had ever slept, had a king-size bed with Egyptian cotton sheets and a panoramic view of the backyard. "You can let me take care of him," Martha offered, her hands already busy organizing clean towels and separating some clothes that belonged to her nephew, who occasionally stayed at the mansion. Charlie, however, clung to the sleeve of Richard's jacket, his eyes silently begging him not to leave. "Stay, please." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, gently holding the boy's hand. "I'm not going anywhere. Martha is just going to help make you more comfortable, okay?" With a timid nod, Charlie allowed Martha to help him clean up and change clothes. Every movement was cautious, as any pressure on his legs made him wince in pain. Throughout the process, his eyes never left Richard for a second, as if fearing he might disappear at any moment. Dr. Paul arrived 40 minutes later, carrying his medical bag. He was a grey-haired gentleman with a gentle look, a trusted pediatrician whom Richard knew through his philanthropic work in hospitals. The examination was thorough and delicate. The doctor's experienced hands evaluated every inch of Charlie's legs, while the boy bit his lip to keep from crying. Richard remained by his side, holding his hand and murmuring words of encouragement. "The injuries are old," Dr. Paul explained later, in a low voice, when he managed a moment alone with Richard in the hallway. "There were poorly healed fractures in both legs. He needs surgery and intensive physiotherapy, but with proper treatment, the chances of recovery are good." Richard ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that always betrayed his concern. "I'm going to need your discretion, Paul. I don't know the full story yet, but I suspect that—" "I understand perfectly," the doctor interrupted, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'll prepare a detailed report and contact some trusted specialists. In the meantime, I've prescribed painkillers and anti-inflammatories to relieve the discomfort." After the doctor left, Richard returned to the room. He found Charlie fighting sleep, his heavy eyes closing and opening at increasingly longer intervals. Martha had managed to make him eat some light soup and take the medications. "Rest a bit," Richard whispered, adjusting the covers. "We'll talk. More tomorrow. Promise you'll be here when I wake up." Charlie's voice was just a sleepy murmur. "I promise," Richard replied, sitting in the armchair next to the bed. "You can sleep peacefully." As he watched the boy finally surrender to sleep, Richard took out his cell phone and began making calls. First to his lawyer, Mr. Henry, explaining the situation and requesting that he immediately start the necessary legal procedures. Then to his assistant, cancelling all appointments for the next day. Martha entered the room silently, bringing a cup of coffee. "You should rest too," she suggested, concerned. Richard shook his head, his eyes fixed on Charlie's sleeping figure. "I can't, Martha. Not now. I need to understand how a child ends up in this state, who allowed this to happen." The housekeeper sighed, knowing well that determined tone in her boss's voice. "The important thing is that he's safe now," she said softly. "We'll solve the rest bit by bit." The hours of the early morning dragged on as Richard kept vigil, his mind working incessantly. Something about that boy had awakened feelings he had kept dormant for years, memories of his own childhood, of helplessness, of loneliness. But now he had the power to make a difference, to prevent another child from going through what he had experienced. The light of dawn was beginning to filter through the curtain slits when Charlie stirred, his eyes opening slowly. Upon finding Richard still sitting in the armchair, a small smile lit up his face. "You really stayed," he whispered, as if he could hardly believe it. "I always keep my promises, Charlie," Richard replied, feeling his heart warm with that smile. "And this is just the first of many I intend to keep." The next morning, the law offices of Anderson and Associates were buzzing with the unexpected arrival of Richard Morgan. Mr. Henry, a middle-aged man with tortoiseshell glasses and greying hair at the temples, received his most important client with a worried expression. "Richard, I've got some preliminary documents about the boy," he said, leafing through a folder. "His full name is Charlie Sanders, 10 years old. He was registered in Buffalo, but the subsequent records are confusing. There are significant gaps." Richard leaned over the mahogany desk, his eyes scanning the scattered papers. "And the parents?" "That's where the story gets murky," Henry replied, adjusting his glasses. "Mary Sanders and Paul Sanders both disappeared about 6 months ago. There are records of various debts in their names, including loans from loan sharks. The last known address was an apartment in downtown Buffalo." "And no one looked for him? No missing person report?" "Just one made by the teacher at the school where he studied. But when social services went to check, the family had already moved." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the anger growing in his chest. How could parents abandon a child like this? In his mind, flashbacks of Charlie shivering in the park mixed with his own memories of loneliness. "What are our options, Henry?" The lawyer leaned back in his leather chair. "We can file for temporary custody alleging abandonment and risk, but we need to act fast before Child Protective Services is notified and tries to intervene." "Do whatever is necessary," Richard determined. "Use all available resources. I won't allow him to go back to the streets or be thrown into the system." Meanwhile, at the mansion, Martha was watching Charlie eat his breakfast. The boy ate slowly, still hesitant, as if fearing the food might be taken away from him at any moment. "Would you like some more juice, dear?" she offered gently. Charlie shook his head, his eyes fixed on the window. "Where's Richard?" "He had to resolve some important matters, but he'll be back soon," Martha explained, sitting next to him. "Do you want to tell me a little about yourself while we wait?" The boy was silent for a long moment, playing with the spoon on his plate. Do you think he'll send me away when he knows?" "Knows what, Charlie?" Tears began to form in the boy's eyes. "That it was my fault, that I couldn't hold the money right, and they got angry and—" His voice faltered. Martha felt her heart tighten. Gently she held the boy's trembling hand. "Nothing that happened was your fault, dear. Absolutely nothing." At that moment, Richard returned to the mansion, accompanied by a professional-looking woman carrying a briefcase. "Charlie, this is Dr. Laura," Richard introduced. "She's a psychologist who's going to talk to you a bit, okay?" The boy cast a frightened look at Richard. "Will you stay too?" "If you want, I'll stay right here by your side." During the session, conducted with extreme sensitivity by Dr. Laura, fragments of Charlie's story began to emerge. His parents had gotten involved with dangerous people, incurring ever-increasing debts. They started using their son to beg for money on the streets, forcing him to stay out for hours under sun or rain. When the money wasn't enough, punishment came in the form of violence. "It was one of those times," Charlie whispered, clinging to Richard's hand, "that they pushed me. I fell down the stairs. After that, my legs were never good again." Richard felt his entire body tense with anger, but kept his voice calm. "You're safe now, Charlie. No one will hurt you anymore." Dr. Laura made some notes in her notebook. "I'll need a few more sessions, but I can already prepare a preliminary report to support the custody request." After the psychologist left, Richard found Martha in the kitchen, silent tears running down her face as she prepared lunch. "How can someone do this to a child?" she murmured, wiping her eyes with her apron. "They can't, Martha. And they won't." "Anymore," Richard replied, his determination evident in every word. "I'm going to give him the family he deserves to have." Back in the room, Richard found Charlie leafing through a storybook that Martha had set aside for him. "Do you like reading?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I do," Charlie replied, a small smile appearing on his face. "At school, the teacher always read to us. It was the best part of the day. You know, when I was your age, I loved reading too," Richard shared. "Books were my way of escaping, of dreaming of a different future." Did you not have a family either?" Richard shook his head. "No. I grew up in an orphanage. But that didn't stop me from building my own path, from finding people who became my family by choice." Charlie's eyes filled with hope. Like Martha. Exactly. And now, Richard hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. If you want, we can be a family too. The boy looked at him with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. Do you really want to be my dad? More than anything in the world, Charlie. The hug that followed was awkward, with Charlie still limited by his injured legs. But it carried all the weight of a silent promise, a new beginning for both of them. Mount Sinai Hospital imposed respect with its modern architecture and cutting-edge technology. Richard walked through the white antiseptic corridors, pushing the wheelchair where Charlie was sitting. The boy nervously gripped the hem of his new shirt, watching the movement of doctors and nurses. It's all right, Richard whispered, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. Dr. Paul has gathered the best specialists to take care of you. In the consultation room, Dr. Helen Martin, one of the country's leading orthopedic surgeons, examined the X-rays with meticulous attention. Her experienced eyes scanned every detail of the images as she made notes on her tablet. The old fractures have consolidated inadequately, she explained, pointing to the problematic areas. A two-step procedure will be necessary. First, we're going to correct the bone alignment and then perform the reconstruction of the damaged ligaments. Charlie squeezed Richard's hand, his face paling. Will it hurt a lot? The doctor smiled gently, approaching him. You'll be asleep during the entire surgery, and afterwards we'll make sure you don't feel pain. The most important part will be the physiotherapy, which will require a lot of dedication from you. How long until he can walk normally? Richard asked. With proper treatment and dedication to physiotherapy, we estimate between 6 months to a year for significant recovery. But each case is unique, and Charlie is young, which favors recovery. While they were discussing the details of the procedure, a nurse hurriedly entered the room, whispering something in Dr. Helen's ear. The doctor frowned, quickly glancing at Charlie before addressing Richard. Mr. Morgan, can we talk in private? For a moment. In the corridor, the doctor closed the consultation room door before speaking. There's a woman at reception claiming to be the boy's biological mother. She's demanding to see him and threatening to call the police. Richard felt his blood run cold. Mary Sanders? Exactly, she presented documents proving she's Charlie's mother. Don't let her near him, Richard instructed, already taking out his cell phone to call his lawyer. Mr. Henry is in the process of filing for temporary custody. That woman abandoned her son in a risky situation. Inside the room, Charlie sensed something was wrong. Years of survival on the streets had made him sensitive to subtle changes in the environment. When Richard returned, trying to maintain a calm expression, the boy was already trembling. They're back, aren't they? He whispered, his eyes wide with fear. They're going to take me away. Richard knelt in front of the wheelchair, holding the small trembling hands in his. Listen, Charlie, I promised I'd protect you, remember? No one is going to take you anywhere. In the hospital lobby, the situation was unfolding tensely. Mary Sanders, a woman with an unkempt appearance and a nervous look, was gesticulating frantically while arguing with security. It's my right to see my son, she shouted. Who does that man think he is to stop me? Mr. Henry arrived quickly, carrying a folder with documents. Mrs. Sanders, I'm Mr. Morgan's lawyer. At the moment, there's a temporary custody process underway, based on evidence of abandonment and neglect. Any attempt to contact the minor must be mediated by the court. Abandonment? I never abandoned my son. We were going through difficulties, but difficulties that resulted in serious injuries to the boy, the lawyer interrupted, his voice firm. We have medical and psychological reports that prove the mistreatment. While the discussion continued in the lobby, Richard opted to take Charlie through an alternative exit from the hospital. Martha was waiting for them in the car, ready for any emergency. Let's go home, son, Richard said, helping him into the vehicle. We'll come back tomorrow to schedule the surgery. During the journey, Charlie remained silent, his body still trembling slightly. It was only when they reached the mansion that he finally spoke. I don't want to go back with them, he murmured, tears running down his face. Please don't let them take me. Richard hugged him carefully, feeling his heart break with the evident fear in the boy's voice. They won't take you, Charlie. I'll fight for you with all my strength. That night, after Charlie finally fell asleep, Richard met with Mr. Henry in his office. The lawyer looked worried as he reviewed some documents. They're going to try to use the financial factor in their favor, Henry explained. They'll claim that now they have the means to take care of the boy, that the abandonment was temporary, due to economic difficulties, and the injuries, the psychological trauma, doesn't that count? It counts, and a lot. But we need to prepare for an intense legal battle. They won't give up easily, Richard. Neither will I, he replied, his determination evident in every word. That boy has suffered enough. I won't allow him to go through any more trauma. Marina entered the office bringing coffee, her face marked with concern. Caleb is having nightmares, she informed. He keeps calling for you in his sleep. Richard stood up immediately. Keep working on the documents, Henry. I need to be with him now. In the bedroom, he found Caleb restless in bed, mumbling incoherent words. He sat beside him, gently stroking his hair until he calmed down. I'm here, son, he whispered, and I'll always be. The John Adams courthouse was busy that Monday morning. Richard adjusted his tie in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to maintain his composure despite the anxiety consuming him. It was the day of the first hearing about Caleb's guardianship. Everything will be all right, assured Henry, checking the document folder one last time. We have medical reports, psychological evaluations, and witnesses that prove the situation of abandonment and mistreatment. In the hallway, Marina held Caleb's hand, who was especially quiet in his wheelchair. The boy wore a new light blue dress shirt and dress pants, clothes Richard had bought especially for the occasion. Remember what we talked about? Asked Richard, crouching down to be at eye level with the boy. You just need to tell the truth. To the judge, don't be afraid. Caleb nodded, his fingers nervously gripping the wheelchair's armrest. What if they're there? I'll be by your side the whole time, promised Richard. They can't hurt you anymore. The courtroom was smaller than Caleb had imagined, but it seemed equally intimidating with its austere furniture and solemn air. Judge Carmen Silvera, a middle-aged woman with a serene expression, occupied her position behind the elevated desk. The other side of the room, Melissa and Paul Oliver sat with their lawyer. Melissa tried to smile at Caleb, who immediately looked away, shrinking in his chair. Paul maintained an impassive expression, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Before we begin, announced Judge Carmen, I'd like to speak privately with Caleb in my chambers. It's a standard procedure in custody cases. Richard felt his heart tighten as he watched Caleb being taken away by the social worker. The boy cast one last frightened look in his direction before the door closed. In the chambers, decorated more warmly than the courtroom, Judge Carmen sat next to Caleb, abandoning her previous formality. Tell me a bit about how your life has been these past few weeks, Caleb, she asked gently. The boy hesitated, playing with the hem of his new shirt. It's different. Richard takes me to the doctor. Marina cooks for me every day and I have my own bed. And how was it before? Tears began to form in Caleb's eyes. I had to stay on the street asking for money. If I didn't get enough, they would get angry. That's why I fell down the stairs. The judge made some notes, keeping her voice soft. And how do you feel living with Richard? For the first time since entering the chambers, a small smile appeared on Caleb's face. He promises things and keeps them. No one ever did that before. He said he'd help me walk again, and he really is helping. He makes me feel safe. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Melissa Oliver was the first to testify. Her voice choked as she tried to explain her actions. We were desperate, Your Honor. The debts just kept piling up. We had nowhere to go. But now we've got jobs. We have a place to live. We want our son back. The Olivers' lawyer presented employment contracts and proof of residence, arguing that the family's situation had stabilized. However, when Henry began his cross-examination, contradictions started to emerge. Mrs. Oliver, can you explain why, even after getting a job, you didn't look for your son for 6 months? Melissa hesitated, her gaze wavering. We We were trying to get everything in order first. And what about the injuries to his legs? How do you explain the medical report that proves multiple poorly healed fractures? Paul Oliver shifted uncomfortably in his chair while Melissa began to cry. It was an accident. We didn't mean to. Dr. Laura presented her psychological report, detailing the trauma experienced by Caleb and his evolution since coming under Richard's care. Marina also testified, describing the gradual transformation of the frightened boy who arrived at the mansion. In the first few nights, she reported, he would hide food under his pillow, afraid of not having anything to eat the next day. Now, for the first time, he's starting to act like a real child. When Richard was called to testify, his voice was heavy with contained emotion. Your Honor, I grew up in an orphanage. I know what it's like to have no one to call family. When I found Caleb in that park, I recognized in his eyes the same fear and loneliness I once felt. I'm not asking for his guardianship out of whim or vanity. I'm asking because, for the first time in my life, I feel I can make a real difference in someone's life. The judge listened to all testimonies carefully, taking detailed notes. When Caleb returned to the room, she observed how he immediately sought Richard's proximity, how his posture visibly relaxed beside the businessman. Given the complexity of the case, she announced finally, I will determine a 90-day evaluation period, maintaining temporary guardianship with Mr. Richard Morgan. During this period, a social worker will make regular visits to monitor the minor's development. Melissa began to protest, but was restrained by her lawyer. Richard let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, while Caleb squeezed his hand tightly. As for the allegations of mistreatment, the judge continued, a separate inquiry will be opened to investigate the facts. Mr. and Mrs. Oliver are prohibited from attempting any contact with the minor outside the established legal procedures. As they left the courthouse, the afternoon sun bathed New York in golden tones. Richard pushed Caleb's wheelchair towards the car, where Marina was waiting for them. Can we have ice cream? Caleb asked timidly, looking up hopefully. Richard smiled, feeling his heart warm. Of course we can. I think we deserve to celebrate, don't you? And tomorrow, are we still going to physical therapy? Without fail, I promised we'd help you walk again, remember? And I always keep my promises. The smile Caleb gave in response was worth more than all the professional victories Richard had ever achieved in his life. The operating room at Mount Sinai Hospital was in full activity that morning. Richard walked beside the gurney where Caleb lay, holding his hand as the boy was taken for the first of the scheduled surgeries. The child tried to appear brave, but his trembling grip betrayed the fear he felt. Remember what Dr. Helena explained? Richard asked softly. You'll fall asleep, and when you wake up, the first step to regaining your movements will already be taken. Caleb nodded, his eyes fixed on Richard's face. Will you be here when I wake up? Of course. I'll be waiting. Right outside the whole time, Dr. Helena approached, already gowned for surgery. Ready, champ? We're about to start our mission to get you running around again. Can I really run later? If you follow the treatment diligently, you'll be able to do that and much more, the doctor assured, smiling behind her mask. When they reached the operating room doors, Richard had to let go of Caleb's hand. The boy took a deep breath, trying to be strong. Dad, he called for the first time, making Richard freeze in place. I'm scared. Richard felt his heart skip a beat upon hearing the word Dad. Leaning down, he kissed the boy's forehead. Everything will be fine, son, I promise. The following hours were the longest in Richard's life. He paced back and forth in the waiting room, alternating between drinking coffee and checking the clock every 5 minutes. Marina had arrived shortly after, bringing rosaries and medallions that the mansion staff had sent for good luck. You need to calm down, she said, offering a glass of water. Caleb is strong. He'll come out of this surgery successfully. As they waited, Richard received a call from Henry. Richard, we have a situation, the lawyer's voice sounded concerned. The Olivers are trying to negotiate. Negotiate? What do you mean? They propose giving up custody of Caleb in exchange for money. Richard felt his blood boil. They want to sell their own son? Technically, they're proposing compensation, To aid in rebuilding their lives. But yes, in practice, that's what it is. Absolutely not, Richard cut in. I won't participate in this kind of negotiation. Caleb is not a commodity. I completely agree, Henry responded. I'll document this attempt. It could help us in the process. After 4 hours of surgery, Dr. Helena finally appeared in the waiting room. Her smile behind the mask already indicated good news. The surgery was a success, she announced. We managed to realign the bones and make the necessary fixations. Now it's time for recovery and lots of physical therapy. Richard released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When can I see him? He's in recovery. As soon as he wakes up from anesthesia, you can go in. When he was finally able to see Caleb, the boy was still groggy from the anesthesia. His legs were immobilized, and various machines monitored his vital signs. Dad? He called with a hoarse voice. I'm here, son, Richard replied, carefully holding his hand. My leg, will they be okay? Yes, they will. But you'll have to be very persistent with physical therapy. Are you ready? A small smile appeared on Caleb's sleepy face. If you help me, I can do it. The following days were about adaptation. Richard transformed one of the ground floor rooms of the mansion into a small infirmary with all the necessary equipment for Caleb's recovery. Marina took turns with a hired nurse in caring for him, and Dr. Laura continued with therapy sessions, now focused on working through the boy's anxiety about the recovery process. A week after the surgery, during one of the physical therapy sessions at home, Caleb faced his first moment of despair. I can't do it, he shouted, frustrated after several attempts to do the exercises. My legs won't obey. Richard, who accompanied all sessions, sat beside him on the treatment table. You know, when I was building my company, a lot of people said I wouldn't make it, that it was too difficult, that I should give up. What did you do? I kept trying, a little bit each day. Sometimes it seemed like I wasn't making any progress, but when I looked back, I saw how far I had come. Caleb was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. Do you think I'll really be able to walk again? I'm sure of it, but we'll do it together, one step at a time. At night, after Caleb had fallen asleep, Richard found Marina in the kitchen preparing tea. He called me Dad again today, he commented, a soft smile on his face. Marina smiled back. And you're becoming more of a father every day, you know? I've never seen you so happy, even with all this worry. It's strange, Marina. I spent so much time thinking professional success was all I needed. Now, he paused, searching for the right words. Now it feels like I've finally found my purpose. Sometimes life has a funny way of showing us what really matters, she philosophized, serving the tea. That boy brought light to this house, and you brought hope to his life. Richard looked out the kitchen window, observing the full moon shining in the New York sky. Somewhere in the city, he knew the Olivers were still plotting ways to get money at Caleb's expense. But here in this mansion turned home, father and son were beginning to heal old wounds, building a new future together. The physical therapy room installed in the mansion was illuminated by the golden light of late afternoon. It had been 2 months since the surgery, and Caleb was balancing between the parallel bars, drops of sweat running down his face as he concentrated on each movement. Richard watched him attentively, ready to support him if necessary. 2 more steps, encouraged Paula, the physical therapist, staying close. You're doing very well, Caleb. The boy took a deep breath, his arms trembling with the effort of supporting part of his body weight. When he managed to take the requested steps, a radiant smile lit up his face. Dad, did you see? I did it. Richard felt his heart warm, as it always did when Caleb called him Dad. I saw, champ. You're getting stronger every day. Paula made some notes on her clipboard. His progress is surprising. His muscle strength has increased significantly, and his balance improves with each session. After physical therapy, while Marina helped Caleb with his bath, Richard received an unexpected visit. Anna Clark, the social worker assigned by the court, arrived for another of her periodic evaluations. Mr. Morgan, she greeted formally, I've come for another follow-up visit. How is Caleb adapting? Richard led her to his office where he began to show the medical reports and physical therapy evaluations. His physical recovery is progressing beyond expectations, and emotionally I see more smiles, more confidence every day. Anna observed everything with professional attention, making occasional notes. And what about education? Have you thought about how you're going to handle that? I've hired private tutors to help him catch up on the content he missed. As soon as the doctors clear him, we plan to start looking for a suitable school. At that moment, they heard laughter coming from the hallway. Caleb was in his wheelchair, which he now used less and less, playing with Max, the dog Marina had rescued from the street 2 weeks ago. The puppy jumped around the chair, barking happily as the boy petted him. "Dad!" Caleb called out upon seeing Richard. "Max learned how to sit. Want to see?" Anna observed the interaction between the two with interest. The strong bond that had formed was evident, the naturalness with which Caleb called Richard Dad, the way his eyes lit up when seeking his approval. After witnessing a demonstration of Max's new skills, the social worker continued her evaluation, also talking with Marina and Caleb himself. As she was leaving, she made a comment that caught Richard by surprise. "Mr. Morgan, have you thought about making this permanent? The adoption, I mean." Richard felt his heart race. "We're still in the evaluation period for temporary guardianship, which is coming to an end," she completed. "And based on my reports, I see no reason not to recommend continuing the guardianship. The next natural step would be adoption." The idea kept hammering in Richard's head for the rest of the day. At night, while helping Caleb with his math exercises, he decided to bring up the subject. "Caleb," he began cautiously, "are you happy here?" The boy looked up from his notebook, surprised by the question. "Of course I am. Here I have you, Marina, Max. It's the first time I've had a real family." "And if—" Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "If this could be forever, officially?" Caleb dropped his pencil, his eyes widening. "You mean like an adoption? You really want to be my dad forever?" "Only if you want," Richard replied, feeling a lump in his throat. "The decision is yours." The boy was silent for a moment, and Richard felt his heart tighten. Then, without warning, Caleb threw himself into his arms, completely ignoring the math exercises. "Yes, I want to," he exclaimed, tears of happiness in his eyes. "I want it so much." Marina, who was passing by the hallway at that moment, stopped to observe the scene, her own eyes filling with tears. She had always known Richard had a big heart behind his successful businessman facade, but seeing him like this, hugging Caleb with so much love, was a confirmation of how surprising life could be. The next day, Richard scheduled a meeting with Henry to start the adoption procedures. The lawyer listened attentively to his plans, making notes and explaining the necessary steps. "We need to be prepared," he warned. "The Olivers might try to complicate the process when they find out." "They've already shown that they're only interested in money," Richard replied, his voice firm. "I'll fight with all my strength to give Caleb the family he deserves." In the afternoon, during the physical therapy session, Paula noticed something different about Caleb. There was an extra determination in his movements, a new strength in his efforts. "What happened?" she asked, smiling. "You're especially committed today." Caleb smiled, his eyes shining. "I need to get strong soon. I want to be able to walk on the day the judge says Richard will be my dad forever." Richard, who was observing the session, felt his eyes fill with tears. At that moment he knew with absolute certainty that there was nothing in the world that could prevent him from making that dream come true. Caleb was already his son in his heart, and soon he would be in the eyes of the law as well. The news of the adoption request spread quickly through the courthouse corridors. Mr. Hendricks had just filed the paperwork when he received an alarming phone call from his contact in the judiciary. "The Olivers have hired a new lawyer," the voice on the other end of the line informed. "And it's not just anyone. It's Mr. Marcus Thompson." Hendrick's blood ran cold. Thompson was known for his aggressive tactics and for turning around seemingly lost cases. He immediately called Richard. At the mansion, the atmosphere was one of restrained celebration. Caleb had managed to take his first steps without support during physical therapy, and Martha was preparing a special lunch to celebrate. The boy's smile lit up the entire house. "Dad, look!" he exclaimed, taking careful steps towards Richard. There was still a slight limp, but the progress was remarkable. The phone rang, interrupting the moment. Richard answered, his expression changing as he heard the news from Hendricks. "I understand," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral so as not to alarm Caleb. "I'll be there in an hour." At the law office, the emergency meeting revealed the gravity of the situation. "Thompson is building a dangerous narrative," Hendricks explained, spreading documents across the table. "He claims you used your economics power to separate Caleb from a humble family that was going through temporary difficulties." "That's absurd," Richard protested. "They abandoned their own son." "I know, but Thompson is an expert at manipulating public opinion. He's already leaked some stories to the press, painting the Olivers as victims of the system." As predicted, the next morning, the headlines of major newspapers carried the story, "Millionaire businessman tries to take child from humble family. The struggle of working parents to recover their son." Richard tried to shield Caleb from the news, but it was impossible to completely isolate the boy. At the private school where he had recently started studying, some parents began to make comments, and children, being children, repeated what they heard at home. "Is it true that you stole Caleb from his parents?" one of the mother's sons innocently asked during recess. Caleb came home devastated that day. Richard found him in the bedroom, hugging Max, silent tears streaming down his face. "Son, what happened?" "Why are they saying these things? You didn't. You steal me. You saved me." Richard sat down next to him on the bed, his heart heavy. "Some people don't know the whole truth, son. They only hear one side of the story." "Can I tell everyone the truth? Can I tell them what they really did to me?" "You're very brave, Caleb, but you don't need to relive those painful memories. Let's let justice do its job." That night, after putting Caleb to bed, Richard received a surprise visit. Anna Clark, the social worker, showed up at the mansion outside. Her normal hours. "Sorry to come so late," she said, her expression worried. "But I thought you needed to know. Thompson is trying to disqualify all previous reports. He wants a new psychological evaluation of Caleb with a professional chosen by them." "They want to force Caleb to relive all the trauma?" Richard asked, outraged. "It's not just that. They're also questioning the impartiality of Dr. Laura and all the other professionals involved in the case." Martha, who was listening to the conversation from the kitchen door, couldn't contain her indignation. "Don't these people have hearts? After everything they did to that boy?" The situation became even more complicated when Thompson managed to get a court order allowing supervised visits from the Olivers. Caleb panicked when he heard the news. "I don't want to see them. Please, Dad, don't let them near me." Richard hugged his son tightly, feeling him tremble. "Calm down, son. I'll be with you the whole time. They can't hurt you anymore." The first visit was scheduled for a neutral room at the courthouse, with the presence of psychologists and social workers. On the appointed morning, Caleb refused to leave the car. "I can't," he whispered, clinging to the seat. "My legs they're shaking too much." Richard knelt beside the open car door, holding his son's hands. "Remember what you told me when you started physical therapy? That you could do anything if I was by your side?" Caleb nodded, tears in his eyes. "Then trust me one more time. I'll be by your side every second. You're stronger than you think. Son." Taking a deep breath, Caleb finally agreed to enter the building. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, each step a testament to his determination. Richard watched proudly as his son, despite his fear, held his head high. The visitation room was prepared with cameras to record the encounter. When Mary and Paul Oliver entered, Caleb's body tensed, but he didn't back down. On the contrary, his voice, though low, was firm when he spoke. "I don't want to go back with you. I already have a dad, a real dad." The words, simple but powerful, echoed through the room, carrying the weight of a truth that no legal manipulation could erase. The tension was palpable in the conference room of Mr. Hendricks's office. Richard watched attentively as his lawyer examined a recently arrived folder, his face gradually lighting up as he read the documents. "This changes everything," Hendricks said, finally looking up. "The private detective we hired found something the Olivers desperately tried to hide." Richard leaned forward in his chair. "What is it?" Records of other children, Hendricks revealed, spreading documents across the table. Caleb wasn't the first. They have a history of irregular adoptions followed by abandonment when they could no longer extract financial benefits from the situations. The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. You mean they... Exactly. It was a scheme. They legally adopted children, got benefits and donations through moving stories about a poor family caring for orphans, and when the source dried up, they abandoned the children. On the other side of the city, oblivious to these discoveries, Caleb was participating in his physical therapy session. His progress was remarkable. He could now walk for longer periods, using only a cane for support. Paula, the physical therapist, couldn't hide her pride. "You've exceeded all our expectations," she said, helping him with strengthening exercises. "Have you thought about what you want to do when you're fully discharged?" Caleb's face lit up. "I want to play soccer with my dad. He promised he'd teach me when I'm stronger." Martha, who was watching the session, smiled affectionately. It was impressive how the scared boy who had arrived at the mansion months ago had transformed into a confident child full of dreams. The peace of the routine, however, was interrupted by an urgent call. Mr. Thompson had called a press conference, claiming to have bombshell revelations about the case. Richard rushed home, determined to protect Caleb from the media circus that was to come. He found his son in the library doing homework with the help of his private tutor. "Dad," Caleb exclaimed, seeing him arrive earlier than usual, "did something happen?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Richard assured, trying to stay calm. "But I think it would be good for you to spend a few days at the beach house. What do you think?" The boy's eyes lit up. "With you?" "Martha will go with you first. I need to sort some things out here, but I promise I'll come as soon as I can." The next day, while Caleb was safely away from the city, the press conference turned into a boomerang for the Olivers. When Thompson began to present his revelations, alleged evidence that Richard had bribed hospital staff and social workers, Mr. Hendricks asked for the floor. "Before we continue," he said calmly, "I'd like to present some documents to the press." One by one, the Olivers' previous cases came to light. Adoption records, archived complaints, testimonies from social workers from other cities. The pattern was clear and irrefutable. The repercussion was immediate. The same newspapers that had painted the Olivers as victims now printed headlines about the child exploitation scheme. Public opinion, which was divided, began to shift rapidly. Amidst the chaos, an unexpected figure sought out Richard. It was Sarah, one of the former social workers who had followed the Olivers in another state. "I tried to stop it," she recounted, her voice laden with guilt. "I realized what they were doing, but I couldn't gather enough evidence at the time. When I saw Caleb's case in the newspaper, I couldn't stay silent." Sarah's testimony, along with the evidence gathered by the detective, was the last straw. Mr. Thompson abandoned the case, citing ethical divergences with his clients. The Olivers, cornered, finally showed their true colors. "How much do you want?" Paul Oliver asked, appearing without warning in Richard's office. "We'll give up everything, never get near the kid again, just give us fair compensation." Richard felt a mix of disgust and pity. "You still don't understand, do you? Caleb is not a commodity. He's my son, and no amount of money in the world will change that." That night, Richard drove to the beach house, where he found Caleb asleep on the couch, Max faithfully lying at his feet. Martha explained that he had spent the whole day at the beach, practicing his exercises in the sand, as Paula had recommended. Sitting next to his sleeping son, Richard realized that all the battles, all the emotional wear, every moment of worry, it had all been worth it. Here was his true treasure, not in the vaults of his banks or in the value of his companies, but in the unconditional love he felt for this boy that fate had placed in his path. Caleb stirred in his sleep, murmuring, "Dad?" "I'm here, son," Richard replied softly, "and I'm never leaving your side again." The sea breeze came in through the open windows, bringing with it the promise of better days. The shadows of the past were finally beginning to dissipate, giving way to the light of a new dawn for this family, that was formed not by blood but by love. The courthouse was especially busy on that sunny spring morning. Richard adjusted Caleb's tie, who was wearing a tailored suit for the special occasion. The boy couldn't contain his anxiety, alternating between nervous smiles and apprehensive looks at his father. "What if something goes wrong?" he whispered. As they waited outside the courtroom, Richard knelt to be at eye level with his son. "Nothing will go wrong, you know why? Because we're already a family here," he pointed to his heart. "Today is just for the judge to confirm what we already." "No." Martha arrived hurriedly, carrying a bouquet of flowers. Her eyes were already misty even before the hearing began. "I brought this for after the ceremony," she explained, smiling through contained tears. The courtroom was full. Besides the legal team, Dr. Laura, Paula the physical therapist, Anna Clark the social worker, and even Dr. Paul, who had cared for Caleb since the first day, were present. All those who had been part of this journey wanted to witness its final moment. Judge Carmen entered the room, bringing with her a folder that contained the fate of that family. Her discreet smile already indicated good news. "We are here today," she began, "to finalize a process that I have followed from its beginning. I saw an injured and frightened child transform into a strong and confident boy. I saw a successful man discover that his greatest achievement was not in his business, but in the love of a son." Caleb held Richard's hand tightly as the judge continued. "The reports are unanimous. Caleb's physical and emotional evolution under Mr. Richard Morgan's care is remarkable. The allegations against the former guardians have been duly investigated and are being dealt with in the criminal sphere. There is no longer any legal or moral impediment to what we are going to formalize today." She paused, smiling directly at Caleb. "Young man, would you like to say something before the final decision?" The boy stood up, leaning slightly on his cane. His voice, once so shy, now sounded clear and confident. "I learned that family isn't just who has the same blood. Family is who takes care of us, who stays by our side in difficult times, who helps us get up when... So we fought literally in my case," he smiled, drawing soft laughter from the audience. "Richard, my dad, he taught me that I can be strong, that I can dream, that I deserve to be loved. He not only saved my life, he gave me a new life." Richard couldn't hold back the tears that ran down his face. Martha in the back rows sobbed quietly into her handkerchief. The judge, visibly moved, picked up her gavel. "For all that has been presented, and considering the best interest of the child, I grant the request for full adoption. From this moment on, Caleb will be called Caleb Morgan, legitimate son of Richard Morgan, with all the rights and duties that the law confers." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, but was almost drowned out by the applause and congratulations. Caleb threw himself into Richard's arms, who hugged him tightly, finally letting his own tears flow freely. "Now it's forever, Dad," Caleb whispered. "Forever, son," Richard replied, his voice choked with emotion. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone with special force. Martha distributed the flowers she had brought, while everyone gathered for photos. Paula, the physical therapist, couldn't hide her pride as she saw Caleb standing almost without support for the photographs. "You know what this means?" Richard asked his son as they walked towards the car. "What?" "That now we can start planning. That soccer game you want so much." Caleb's eyes sparkled. "Really? You think I can already?" "Paula said you're ready for more intense activities. We just need to take it easy at first." At the mansion, a small celebration awaited. The staff had decorated the garden with balloons and banners, and Martha had coordinated the preparation of all of Caleb's favorite dishes. Max ran from side to side, infected by the general joy. During the party, Richard watched his son playing with other children of employees and some schoolmates. There was no longer any sign of the frightened boy he had found in that park. In his place was a happy, secure, loved child. "What are you thinking about, son?" Caleb asked, approaching his father with a piece of cake. Richard smiled at the question. He was usually the one asking that. "About how life can surprise us. You know, I spent years building companies thinking that success was measured by the size of the bank account, but only now with you have I understood what it means to be truly rich." Caleb hugged his father around the waist. "I'm very rich now too." I have the best dad in the world." The sun was setting on the New York City horizon, painting the sky with vibrant colors. In the garden of the mansion, which was now truly a home, father and son watched the sunset, their hearts overflowing with love and gratitude. The future opened up before them, full of promises and possibilities, a new chapter in a story that was just beginning. Martha approached with a camera. How about a photo to mark the moment? Richard and Caleb smiled together for the photo, their eyes shining with the same light of happiness. They were no longer two lonely people looking for their place in the world. They were a family, united not by blood, but by something much stronger, the unconditional love they had built day after day, overcoming each obstacle, winning each battle until they arrived here at their happy ending, that was in fact just the beginning of a new journey.